What's going on, everybody? We are back here, the noob and the knower. This is the part 2 of finding fish, finding places to fish, finding fishable water, finding fishable fish. So today, now we're going to move on from the water that we've already discovered, and we're actually going to find the fish within that water that we've discovered. Isn't that right, Lance?
Sounds perfect.
All right.
I said it was perfect. That's perfect. Perfect. Let's keep going.
A perch is a perch. That's a line I said in one of the pilots when I was doing this with George Daniel, and it's one of my favorite lines I've ever said in my life because I was asking questions about pike, and somehow we started talking about perch, and I was like, so is a pike related to a perch? He's like, no, a perch is a perch. I was like, a perch is a perch. So feel free to steal that.
Literally is a perch. Pike is an esox.
Exactly, it is. We learned that in the pilot that no one will ever hear. No, there's a good chance we'll put those out. For those of you that don't know, I actually did the pilots for this show were done with George Daniel, another fly fisher in the community that is quite well known and a very nice dude from Pennsylvania.
A fellow fish nerd.
Buddy of Lance as well, I think.
Yes, true.
Maybe at some point we'll release those, but anyhow, let's move on. Part 2, finding fish. This is a good one because this becomes like a way of life. When you start to like really get into it and you can go to a place and you're like, there's a fish there and you're right. It's the best feeling. And the only way you can do that is by time on the water, but also learning the theory behind where these people hang out. And by people, I mean the Pisces, the fish. So first and foremost, let's just break it down. When we are in these places, I don't know. I mean, maybe you should tell me. I don't know if this only applies to rivers or if it's also like fishing in saltwater and stuff like that. But I think that the big major player in most of this stuff is temperature. Is that right?
That's definitely a big player. I mean, water temperature varies greatly depending on which species you're chasing, right? But if you're talking trout, there's a pretty wide temperature range that trout will feed and be active in. There are, where trout are found, they are not very often below temperatures where they will feed, and they're probably more commonly the water temperature can be too warm. But other species, bass can be too cold for them sometimes. Saltwater, I've fished saltwater, I don't know how many times, lots of times, but I'm certainly not an expert in saltwater fishing, so I couldn't tell you a lot about the temperature swings in saltwater.
I guess what I was trying to get at by saying that was kind of like, so seasons change and that kind of changes the fish's behavior. The things that come in and influence the fish's behavior. Of course, I'm not the expert, you are, but this is from what I've gathered, is water temperature would be number 1, and then like photo period would be number 2, which is like, when the sun goes down, when it rises.
Mm-hmm.
This is Pisces Varies, an NATK segment where I, Jen Ripple, define fishy words for you. Boom! Photo period, noun. Photo period is science terminology, the period of time each day during which an organism receives illumination. Example in context. Let's wait to take the Instapic. This is not my best photo. Period.
Seasonally, those types of things make fish behave differently. And this is something because I have, I've tried to throw myself in the freshwater fishing as well as the saltwater fishing, trout fishing, and also colder species and warmer species. It seems like it's a kind of a theme that I've noticed overarching is that season is going to change where you look for these fish. And then more specifically, it's water temperature and then also photo period, which comes with it.
I follow that logic. I think that's the real simple version, right? But then the water temperature, as you know, would affect lots of other things. It affects the fish's metabolism, metabolic rate. Yep. Speaking of trout fishing, it affects when insects are or are not hatching. It affects hatches of fish as well. So if you're fishing in salt water or you're fishing for a species that's eating smaller prey, then that influences when those prey are available, when they hatch, when they become fry, when they move into shallower waters, or maybe when they move into spawn. There's all kinds of things there that temperature is changing, and therefore I think I'm with you in that. Therefore, temperature is a huge differentiator in fishing.
The other really, really big thing is actually structure. So when we're talking about finding fish, you'll hear everybody say this word, structure.
Pisces Varies. Boom. Structure, noun. Structure is anything in a body of water that forces a physical change. Rocks, depressions, two water currents colliding, points, troughs, sunken shopping carts are all examples of structure. Example in context. Do you think that rock face had Botox? Or was it just born naturally with such nice structure?
It's kind of like an amorphous word because structure means like 90 things in reality. It's not just like one thing. It's not even necessarily like an object. Sometimes it can just be flat water against choppy water. That's considered a structure too.
Yeah.
So maybe you can go through a little bit of maybe the definition or your definition of structure and then different types of structure that we might find.
Well, like you said, structure is hard to define because it is lots of things. Structure could be banks, it could be large rock, it could be sand, it could be cobblestone, it could be roots, could be undercut banks, it could be riprap.
What'd you call me?
I call you all kinds of things, riffraff. Or I might have said riprap. It's hard to tell for sure. It could be shade, could be a type of structure.
Interesting. That's a good one.
Versus sun could be a type of structure. I mean, there's never-ending options, like you said, very well said in structure. But I think generally speaking, most people are going to equate structure with something that's physical, a physical change, whether that's a change in the bottom, whether that's a change in depth, a drop off in a trout stream. Structure could be large boulders, could be slower water near faster water, or faster water near slower water. Imagine that.
Flip it and reverse it.
Deep thoughts here.
I think you said something that's super important though, and I think it kind of is the definition of structure. And what is structure? Structure is change. It's a change that happens in an environment that, it's like if the river bottom is all a bunch of pebbles and then there's a boulder there, that's a change.
Yeah.
Right? If we're on a lake and it's a bunch of choppy water and then there's like this flat part, that's a change too. Or if everything's sunny and then there's a spot of shade, that's a change too.
Right.
I think that was really an important takeaway from what you were saying and how to describe what structure is. It is something that's different from the norm, I guess.
Yeah. Open water versus weed beds, shallow versus deep, all those could be structure, right?
I'm structure and you're structure because you're shallow and I'm deep.
I've been called worse by better people. What else you got?
That's pretty good. I'm going to have to steal that one. But yeah, so in my notes, I have like a dock is structure, rocks, aquatic plants, depressions in a riverbed, a fallen tree. And the Chicago Harbor, we'll see like a shopping cart turned over and you'll see like 3 bass sitting by that thing. It's like a
real
tire.
structure.
Man-made structure is sometimes some of the best stuff you can get,
Right.
All of those things count. And it's also like, again, just going back to what you were saying, it's also the change, change in the speed of the current could be also considered structure too.
Yeah. Speed, direction, all kinds of things.
But the important thing to take away from structure is that that's where the fish are, There's a saying that a lot of people say, it's like 90% of fish are found in 10% of water. And that 10% of water is the structure. They're hanging around these things that make them kind of get, nearby. I was fishing this bay in Newport Beach, cast my fly out. I was fishing for the spotted bay bass. They're really cool looking fish. When I cast my fly out, I got stuck on these weeds. And there was like a floating mass of weeds, They weren't like tethered to the ground or anything. They were just like floating.
Floats them.
Yep. And so I like kind of walked out there to kind of get my fly out. It's probably like, 3.5, 4 feet of water or something. I lift up this weed thing and 3 bass shot from underneath.
Oh, wow.
So it was literally just something that was floating just by itself in the middle of the water. There was nothing holding it, but the fish were attracted to it because it's cover, it's structure. So things like that happen all the time. And as fisher people, we need to try and find the structure. So when you're looking at a piece of water, I think the first thing you should do is figure out where the structure is.
I think that's crucial. I mean, structure is a broad subject here, but absolutely, you got to find where those fish are hanging.
Exactly. All right, so let's actually put this into play in real life scenario here, and we're going to start out with rivers. And I think as fly fishers, if you have a chance to fish for trout, it's a really good place to start. Obviously, some people don't have that, so they can fish for bass and panfish and stuff, and all of these fish will hang around structure. But river fishing is just such an enjoyable thing to do. I grew up randomly fishing here and there, nothing ever serious, but it was always like on a lake or in a canoe or something like that, where somebody would be like, hey, let's go fish, and you throw a bobber out. But I never really got into river fishing until I started fly fishing, and I think it's one of the big things that draw people to fly fishing, even though you can fly fish in any type of water. But my sister has said this to me before, and my cousin, I just took her out in Pennsylvania over the weekend, and she said the same thing too. There's just something magical about standing in a river in nature and just seeing the water pass you, the sound of the water passing you.
Moving water.
There's something very cathartic about it. So
Lifeblood of Mother Earth.
it's true. As emo as it sounds.
What was that you were saying about you being deep and me shallow?
There you go. I think you just schooled me on that.
Well, I don't know. I try.
I'm gonna have to have you start writing my lyrics.
That's probably not a good idea.
Yeah, you're right. So I think it's such a big part of the soul of fly fishing that it's something that you should try and explore. For that reason also, I think we should start with it. And we're just going to break down a bit the different parts of a river and then where you might find fish in those parts. So you take a river and there's different pieces that have names and they all kind of have their own little story to them. So I'm going to have Lance break this down for us. I'm going to throw one at him and he's going to describe it and then kind of tell us where we can typically find fish in these places. And please remember that the fish are going to move around, again, depending on the season and the temperature of the water, etc. So keep that in mind, and maybe we'll touch upon that a bit too. So the first one I have here in my notes is a riffle.
Okay.
How would you describe a riffle?
Riffle usually has bouncy water. I oftentimes use the term textured water. It has, water that's not flat, that has texture to it, whether that's choppy, whether that's bouncy, whether that's, big waves, and on and on. A riffle in most rivers would be, it'd move at maybe walking speed type of, maybe a little faster than walking speed.
Is this choppy water? Is it all kind of uniform? Or is it like broken up a bit?
It can be either of those. Depends a bit on the rock structure on the bottom, but a riffle is caused by usually larger substrate, larger rocks or boulders. That's, let's say on the small side of things, maybe cobblestone. On the bigger side of things, bowling ball or slightly larger sized boulders on the bottom that are submerged, but they're uneven on the bottom and they're creating some choppiness to the surface. And because those boulders are uneven, they slow the flow of the river near the bottom, and the surface is moving quite fast relative to the speed of the river near the river bottom.
Okay.
The riffle often is picking up speed. It's often shallow and, shallower than surrounding areas oftentimes.
Where would we find a fish in the riffle?
Anywhere in a riffle. Ideally, if there's any slower sections of water that you can see on the surface in a riffle, they will likely be in anything that they can get that's a little bit slower than surrounding currents. But the riffle is a great place for a fish to be, a trout especially in a river, because of that slowed flow near the bottom. So they'll usually be near the bottom in a riffle. If there are some large insects hatching, large being relative, but fish don't often rise for, let's say, midges in a riffle because they're using too much energy. They're not thinking about this.
A midge is a small insect.
A midge is a very tiny insect. Think of 3 millimeters long, maybe 4 millimeters long max. So small insect.
3 millimeters.
They are they're going to lose more energy to get that small insect to move through the water column to eat it than they will gain. They're not reasoning that out, but just instinctually they don't eat those kinds of things in riffles. But if a large grasshopper fell in, or a big stonefly, that's an aquatic insect, is what a stonefly is, something that's maybe an inch long and 2 inches long, 3 inches long, that might be worth their effort. But so generally speaking, you're going to find fish will be eating subsurface in riffles, eating the young stage, the immature stages of aquatic insects for the most part. So mayflies, stoneflies, caddis, midges.
Isn't the riffle where it's like the most active place for the insects in those stages? Isn't it? It's kind of like the factory of them. I think I heard that.
Based on water temp, yes. That would be where a lot of the insects from the river hatch. Not all of them, but many do hatch from riffles. Okay. And riffles, I would argue that riffles are most effective in warmer months, warmer water temperatures. It depends a bit on the speed of the riffle, but generally in the dead of winter, for instance, you wouldn't find as many fish in a riffle as you would in the middle of summer.
Okay. That's kind of a thing that they say is like, don't fish the riffle in winter, right? But there are still fish there, correct?
There's some fish there, yeah, for sure, especially at the tail end of the riffle when it starts to slow down a bit. Maybe not right at the head of it, where in the summertime when water's in a river, in a trout situation, when the water's maybe 55 to 65, those fish could be nosed right up to the drop-off right at the head of a riffle. A riffle is often a place where the river changes depth also. It starts quite shallow and gradually gains a little bit of depth as it loses a little bit of speed.
So it's a fishy place, so you should definitely fish the riffle, right? In the summer.
And yeah, spring, summer, early fall, most definitely. And in some cases, maybe in the winter. But, again, depends on how much slow water is around. Every river is different. But a river that doesn't have really much slow water, there's still going to be some fish in the riffles. They'll just find the slowest spots in the riffles. Okay. Versus if there's a big pool downstream that's slow and deep, which we'll get to here in a minute, then there will probably be more active fish in that slower water in the colder months. Colder water temperature times.
Let's move right along then. So a riffle then kind of turns into a run. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would argue that. The run is a little bit more of a vague term, I think, in describing a river, but the run part of it to me is where the riffle kind of starts to slow, maybe starts to gain depth quite a bit more than the riffle. It's a popular place for fish to be kind of almost all seasons because it's just slow enough that fish would be in there regardless of water temp. There's still a lot of food. The riffle I didn't mention too, the riffle often brings in a lot of oxygen to the river. Mm-hmm. It's choppy, it's bouncy, so the run is still collected a lot of oxygen and has a lot of opportunity for insects that have hatched in the riffle to drift down to the run, the slightly slower part of that transition.
Is it where Forrest Gump lives?
I think he was running, but I don't think he lives in the run.
Okay, so a run, is it more flat and it's slower?
It can be. I would describe the run as where the riffle starts to lose its texture a bit more on the surface. The textured surface starts to lessen, if you will.
Okay.
It hasn't totally become a pool yet. That would be the next step downstream. It's kind of that transition between riffle and pool. At least to me, somebody else maybe describe it differently, but that's how I would describe a run.
So far we have, if it's summertime, spring, summer, early fall, fish the riffle, that is. Year round, you can hit the run. That's fine.
Right.
Probably you'll be walking down the river, and it's not like you just walk up to this one place and you only fish there. You're going to be walking all up and down this river fishing it. So you're going to run into multiple versions of these. So these are all just kind of guidelines. But anyways, getting back to it, year round, you're going to fish the run. And then the run is going to slow down and get deep, I think, right?
Oftentimes, yes.
And that's when we get to the pool.
When we transition to the
pool. There's usually a party there. There's music and DJ or something. Or you could have, a team of Olympic swimmers that are, diving. Terrible jokes. So let's talk about this pool. This is where most people fish, by the way. If you go,
I agree.
I mean, everybody, even fly fishers, but spin fishers love to fish the pools. That's their thing.
That is their spot. That's even the fly fisher spot for the most part. The pool is where everybody thinks all the fish are. And there are fish in pools for sure. But they're usually the most pressured fish because that's where everybody thinks they live. And it's the place where the fish get the longest look at everything you're trying to show them.
And when you say pressured, you mean a lot of anglers are trying to catch them. Okay.
Yes, good clarification. Lots of people, lots of angler traffic pressuring the fish. Yes, trying to catch them. The pool, though, is where the transition from the riffle and run really slow down, oftentimes deepen out, and current slows dramatically to where it has no texture on the surface at all. It's just basically flat water. Not every river would go riffle, run, pool. Sometimes you'd go straight from a riffle straight to a pool, or you might go riffle to pocket water. There's all kinds of different scenarios, but in a kind of an ideal situation, you'd have a riffle which transitions to the run, then it slows down even more, and then you get the pool. And the pool is, I think, the most effective to fish when the water is very cold. That's when fish will, in a trout stream at least, that's when fish will be most potted up in that water type, and they will be finding most of their food in that water type. So in the colder months, a lot of fish are eating either crustaceans like scuds or sow bugs on a lot of our tailwater fisheries, to Baetis nymphs, which are small mayfly nymphs, midge larvae and pupa, which are very small again, and a lot of those live, midges, for instance, and blackfly larvae can live on the bottom. The blackfly larvae are often on sticks or rocks on the river bottom. Midges will live in the silt. When a river really slows down, it tends to collect silt because instead of being flushed into the flow, it settles in the slower water. And so the pool could have a more silty bottom where you might find more aquatic worms, also called annelids, or cranefly larvae, or midge larvae and pupa.
Show off.
Oh, come on. Basic entomology. I am not an entomologist. entomologist. But
he's just an annelid.
If we call them annelids, hardly anybody will know what we're talking about. And if you call them worms, then the snobby people will say, I don't fish worms. And you're like, well, why not? You fish a sow bug or a scud, right?
That's true.
Yep.
That's
true.
true.
If you're going to draw the line at stuff that doesn't hatch, then you can't fish sow bugs or scuds.
That's true.
Can't have your cake and eat it too.
Fish your annelids, people.
People have this hang up with worm imitations because they think they're bait fishing, but I don't know why that's any different than imitating any other aquatic insect that lives in the bottom of the river.
I'm with you on this.
Pet peeves. The colder months are when they're really congregated in the pools. And
question about the pools, though.
Okay.
So if it's very hot outside,
yes,
do the fish use the pools as a refuge because they're deeper and probably the water's colder, or no?
I wouldn't think that they're any colder actually. If there were springs at the entering from the bottom of a deep pool or something, that might be the case. But in my local rivers, I would argue that in the warmest water temps, which most of our fisheries don't ever get to lethal temperatures, so this might change a bit when water temperatures get really, really warm. But
are your rivers spring creeks or something, or are they tailwaters?
We have a mix of all the above. We have a lot of tailwaters, quite a few freestones, only a handful of true spring creeks. The spring creeks, because they're literally a spring, they come out of the ground with a very consistent temperature, so they don't change a heck of a lot.
What's the Green River?
Green River's a tailwater.
Okay.
Green River's always very cold. Maybe, I couldn't say for sure, but it would surprise me if the water ever got warmer than like 50, 51 degrees coming out of the dam. Okay. So it's, as you get way downstream, it gets warmer, but for the first, 10, 20 miles maybe, it doesn't ever get warm enough to really worry about. The fish don't have to worry about oxygen levels and that kind of stuff. And most of my fisheries in the heat of summer, even when it's 100 degrees outside, 90 to 100 degrees, the fish actually move to the fastest water because there's more oxygen there versus the slower water oftentimes has less oxygen. So that could be different again if you're pushing temps that are high, mid to high 70s, where trout could survive for short periods of time but not long periods of time, then they may pool up. I don't know. I've only fished a handful of places that ever get that warm, and by that time, you really shouldn't be fishing. One of them I can recall.
You're saying the water temperature gets to 70.
70 plus, yeah, you should be leaving the trout alone at that point.
Right.
I can think of one stream that we fished in the morning, and we caught a few fish, and then the fishing really died. We took a temperature, and it was right around 70. And we started just walking around looking for fish to see where they were, and the river was very low at that time as well. And they were all over the place, actually, but some of the fish would just like tuck with their heads under a rock. It was kind of interesting to see what they did. I'm not sure why they did that. They could have been because somebody had been there before us and scared them, or we had scared them and not known it until we saw them trying to take refuge. But they were in strange places. They were definitely not in feeding mode. They were like in survival mode.
I was asking because I fished the driftless like in the heat of summer, so it gets up there like probably like 95 degrees or something.
Okay.
And I did notice that there was a lot of fish pooled up in the deepest pools. There were fish everywhere. They're all spring creeks for the most part there. So the water's super clear. You can see right all the way down to the bottom. Mm-hmm. And I was catching a lot of fish out of this one pool. Went to another one where it was like there was like a hill looking over this pool, and I think they all just see you. It's just like grass meadow.
You get a chance.
Yeah. But I did have. I pulled out a lot of fish out of this one pool, probably like 10 fish out of one pool, and it was super hot. So I thought maybe that they were hanging out there because the water was colder. Because it's kind of like if you jump into a pool in the summertime, like an actual swimming pool, and you go down to like where the diving board is, you get to the bottom, it's like a lot colder than it is at the surface.
Yeah, it's just stagnant though. It's not cycling all the time. So I think that changes it quite a bit.
That makes sense to me. That makes sense.
That is definitely true in a swimming pool, no doubt. I don't think it's, in a really large, deep river, that could have an effect. I think in like most of the rivers I'm fishing where you could wade across them in most places, I don't think you're going to notice a giant temperature. I haven't ever tested it, so I'm speculating here at best, but I don't think you'd see much temperature swing from, I know I don't notice anything from like 6 inches out the bank versus middle of the river near the surface. I haven't taken temps at, 3 feet down versus at the surface. I think it's mixing so much in moving water that you're not going to see much difference.
Okay.
They're likely in those pools because that's where there's more food, or they are like the pool where you didn't see very many of them. The fish will often take shelter in deeper water. If, like you said, you poked your head up over the hill and the fish that were in the tail out then ran to the deepest water because they feel the safest there.
All right, so let's keep moving along here. The next little section of river I have is the tail out, which you just mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about this tail out.
Perfect. So we should mention, and you did a little bit here, but the pool is probably the hardest place to catch fish. I think we brought that up a little bit, but just I want to reiterate that because I tease people in the shop all the time. They want to know, people come in and they say, where are the good spots on the river? I know about this pool or that pool. And you're like, yeah, those are the hardest fish to catch on the river. They're there for sure. But people have this thought in their mind that the pools are the only place. It has to be deep to have fish. And fish will hang in inches of water, especially in medium to warmer water temps. So try to avoid the death to your fishing of only fishing deep pools. Learn to fish different water types.
Learn to fish different water types, okay? Tangents by Lance, okay?
Tangents by Lance, sorry. And then moving right along. So the pool transitions usually to the tail out. The tail out is where the pool loses depth and usually increases in speed because as the river has less depth, the water has to push a little quicker to get out of there. Ends up with a bit of a pinch. It squeezes the water speeds up and often leads into the next section of riffles or pocket water or whatever else is downstream, obviously. So the tail out can hold fish though. Fish, there are oftentimes, let's say mayfly spinners for instance, or caddis spinners. There's all kinds of insects that fall into the river after they're done mating, or maybe an ant, flying ant hatch, or just terrestrial insects that are crawling on the bankside brush that end up falling in the river, and they can get funneled into these little foam lines and feeding areas at a tail out. So you'll oftentimes find, especially in low light periods, fish rising in a shallow tail out that are working, and they're not doing splashy rises. They're making very slow, methodical dimpling rises, barely making an imprint on the surface. So they're sometimes hard to spot.
So a rise is when a fish comes to the surface and eats what's on the surface, right? That would be like a dry fly style.
Perfect explanation. So the tail out can be a very good place to fish. It's not one of the most consistent places to find fish, but I find fish in tail outs again low light periods when there are insects around, hatching insects. Tail outs also a productive place when fish are eating midge larvae and pupa, especially in the winter months. I find a lot of fish in a tail out. It's something to consider. It's not always the best section to fish, but it does hold fish.
And what about, because people are always like, well, where do you find the biggest fish? Where would you find the biggest fish in any of these spots? I think I heard once there was the tail out's a good spot because it's kind of a prime lie.
Interesting.
I don't know if that's true or not.
I've not experienced that. I would say most of the time I find smallish fish to medium-sized fish in a tail out, but
okay.
I mean, it depends on what you call a larger than average fish. I would say is oftentimes in a prime feeding spot, like a riffle, slower spot in a riffle, or in the run right where the riffle starts to slow a little bit. But it depends a lot on species, and then if you're looking for an absolute giant fish, they could be anywhere. But most of the time, I would say near structure that's like bankside vegetation, undercut banks, root balls from trees, any of that kind of stuff could be a real outlier as far as average fish go.
All the biggest fish I've ever caught, I've noticed after pondering it, I do use my brain sometimes, have been, let's say there's a bend, right? And the riffle is like bending outwards. If you come in like 3 feet, it's like slower water right off the side of it. That's where I've caught all my biggest fish.
Yeah, that's a good spot for a larger than average fish, maybe not like not a 30-inch brown trout, but a 20-inch brown trout, right?
Right. That makes sense.
Those slightly larger than average fish are usually in prime lies. Because they're bigger than most of their counterparts, fish will actually jockey for position. They'll battle each other and kind of push each other out of feeding areas. So the dominant fish, which are oftentimes the largest fish because they're pushing around the most weight, are often taking up those prime feeding zones.
Okay.
And that's going to vary depending, again, on water temperature and time of year and what's hatching and what's not and so on. But I would argue, especially with brown trout, which we fish for a lot here in my home state, most of the largest fish I catch each year in a river situation are really tight to banks and often in very shallow water.
Interesting.
And on a lot of my fisheries, a 20 to 24 inch fish would be in a well above average fish. We catch a lot of, let's say on the Provo River is our most popular river locally, and there are tons of 8 to 14 inch fish with a few that sneak into the 15, 16, 18 range range, and then fewer that are 20, 22, and then a few that get up to almost 30 inches. And most of those 20 plus inch fish I catch, tight to banks.
Interesting.
Usually
you scare them away before you even get to fish for them.
If you were wade fishing, yes. A lot of those we catch when we're float fishing, and we are pounding the banks with streamers or pounding the banks with dries and getting, fishing inches off the bank, literally.
Right. That's why you got to practice your casting, folks.
That is a good reason to do it.
Because otherwise you're going to be in the grass.
Losing flies.
And the 30-inch fish.
As the boat tows you away.
All right. I think that's enough on the tail out.
Yeah, agreed. It's a good place to spend some time, but not tons of time. Don't live there.
And I'm learning a lot too, guys, because, I tend to find a place where I think there's a fish and I'll stay there for like an hour. And I will grit it out and really try and catch fish, but maybe I should be doing that in very specific places, not all the places I think there's a fish. So this has been educational for me. Thank you, Lance.
Yes, sir.
Right. So next on the list is glide.
Cool. So a glide is usually a little more uniform flow, almost bank to bank. Depth-wise, it doesn't change as much. Glides usually are on. I would argue you don't see a lot of glides on. There's none on small streams, none on smaller rivers. You kind of need a medium to larger size river before you really start seeing glides where it's pretty laminar flow throughout. A glide is a great place to find fish, but it's hard to target them because it looks very similar bank to bank. It's hard to say, don't fish here, fish there.
Right. That's the problem we have at my sister's. Right behind her house is a glide. So I'm like, I'm probably swinging white flies or something like that, or streamers.
Exactly. Those are great ways to kind of cover a lot of water with a broad brush, if you will, and find where in those glides you can, if you really are paying attention, you can sometimes find there's a little depression or a slight slowdown or some tiny change in the glide that's holding fish. Other times you can't physically, you can't actually visually see a change, but you'll find that, you've been working downstream, swinging wets or swinging a streamer or stripping a streamer, and in one particular, 10 by 20 foot area, you start getting strikes. Mm-hmm. Then you could oftentimes come back and either fish a nymph rig through that same area or a dry and a dropper or however you need to approach it and find fish that are kind of potted up. They're usually in that area for one reason or another. Most time it's because it's slightly slower water or slightly deeper water than surrounding.
So are they not spread out then in a glide? They're not like spread out all over the place? Or?
No, they definitely can be, but it's, again, that's going to boil down to the fish population. In a really dense population of fish, they'd be spread out all over a glide, and they could be everywhere. So that's why you're throwing swinging, presentations or stripping presentations, whether that is wet flies or streamers, you're covering a lot of water, showing it to a lot of fish.
Okay.
Because if you just start throwing a nymph rig or you just start throwing a dry randomly without seeing a fish rise, you're going to have to cover a lot of water and probably have no results.
Okay.
We should point out, too, that we're mostly talking about trout fishing here. That, for a glide for a still header would be a different, process and a different opportunity than for a trout angler.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because, it's good to know what all these places are and what their names are and kind of their characteristics. But as far as like fish species, we tend to talk about like warm water fish, like the bass, carp, catfish, panfish. So
like
those, yes. And I feel like all of those fish kind of live like their own story and they live in their own places. So we're just going to talk about trout because it's just each one would have its own podcast for each section of a river,
Sure.
So a lot of them like really slow water. A lot of them are the opposite of the trout. So again, that's why the internet exists. We can definitely all do a Google search and figure that out. But since we're here sitting with one of the world's most premier trout anglers, I figure let's stick to the trout for this sort of thing because it's not a bad setup, at least, because we got Lance here. And now, a word from our sponsors.
From the vise to the boat, to the bank, to those moments you connect to a fish, Loon Outdoors is with you every step of the way with tools designed at the bench and on the water to help make your best day on the water better.
The next couple that we have are kind of like more specific and kind of nuanced, and I would say they're like B targets They're not like the number ones.
Mm-hmm.
The first one that comes up is an eddy.
Cool.
Why don't you describe an eddy, and it's not your cousin.
Cousin eddy is not it. No, they're sometimes called back eddies, right? I think they're called that because the flow reverses. So an eddy would be described as something that contradicts the main flow. So the main flow of the river, if everybody can kind of visualize, is going from your left to your right, and an eddy is usually created by a bankside structure, be it a rock, be it a giant tree or a log, or just a point in the river that sticks out, and the current that goes around it is going fast enough that when it hits that object, it actually recirculates and changes the direction of the current just near that edge. So they're almost always on banks. They can be mid-river behind a big giant rock or something, but most of the time they're limited to banks, and they are, again, reversing the flow. So if the current was going from left to right in the main stream of the current, an eddy would be going from right to left and then recycling and circulating back into the main current.
It's like a slow, like whirlpool almost.
Yeah. They could be moving. You hit it on the head. Slow is the key there. A whirlpool it's spinning the opposite direction as the main current, but it's going very slow.
Right.
They oftentimes have a bit of depth to them. Fish love them because they're a collection point for insects to fall in and get. The fish aren't fighting the main current. They've got structure nearby. There's some sort of structure creating the eddy, whether that's big rocks, whether that's a point, whether that's a tree, downed log. There's something that's there that they can use as refuge, and it's a great place to ambush prey. And
when you fish an eddy, I don't want to get too deep in it. Mm-hmm. And actually, your videos cover eddy fishing.
Good point. Our adaptive fly fishing has a whole section on eddies that we would recommend people check out.
That movie in particular does cover all of these spots, and it's super informative, so highly recommended.
Adaptive fly fishing, it's available for digital download on Vimeo.com.
Yeah, and we'll put a link in the show notes to that for sure, and it's kind of like the noob's guide to your own nymphing. I think everyone should have it. It's just like, it's going to become a classic forever. Like, it's just one of those things that's going to be
that
revered.
One would be modern nymphing, and modern nymphing elevated would be that way. And then adaptive is a little bit of your own nymphing, but more all techniques. Dry dropper, streamers, that kind of stuff.
It's kind of like when someone's like,
oh, his band kind of sounds like it's like rap rock.
And then the artist is like,
no, actually, it's not. It's like pop with indie rock mixed in.
Yeah, but thank you for noticing.
No, he's down. I was thinking of the first two when I was talking about it. But yeah, get the videos, and I get nothing for saying that, just so you guys know.
I get a little bit, just so you know, full disclosure, I do get a little bit.
As you should.
Nobody's getting rich, trust me, but I do get a little bit.
A lot of work went into those things. And you
couple gallons of gas in my tank every month or two.
Well, that's good. Oh, well, I was going to ask you about fishing the eddy.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're fishing eddies, the last time I tried to do it, I almost just kind of like left my fly just kind of sitting there, like tried to stall it, and I was catching fish that way. Is that like a good tactic to do?
Could be, depending. You were fishing what kind of a fly? Like a nymph, a streamer, a dry?
Yeah, it was a nymph.
Yeah.
I was nymphing, yeah.
Yeah, so it depends on the speed of the eddy, right? Well, a lot of times that works great. I use streamers in eddies a lot of times. A jig streamer works really well on an eddy. Fishing a dry and a dropper is a great way to fish an eddy. If it's a really large eddy on a larger river, an indicator rig can work really well. There's all kinds of ways to fish eddies. I think one thing that you were probably thinking about as you started to describe it, how to fish it is it's important to consider your approach on an eddy, because normally you would approach most fishing situations in a river from downstream of the fish. The fish are upstream of your position. And the eddy it's the same principle, but you got to remember the current is reversed. So you would be approaching from upstream compared to the main flow, but you're downstream to the fish in most situations anyway, to the current direction in the eddy. Okay. So you're still fishing from downstream of the fish. And again, this is a general, every situation is different, but if it's a small enough river that you could wade close to it, you could fish it straight across from the eddy as well, wade mid-river and then cast into the eddy.
Yeah, that's what I did.
And on a lot of small to medium-sized rivers, that works great. On big water, you can't go stand in the middle of the river and fish the eddy, so you're going to be on the bank usually.
Okay. We got pocket water up next.
Awesome. Pocket water is one of my favorite places to fish.
It's got a lot of change in it.
Pocket water is that, yeah, lots of pockets, constant change, right? You've got pocket water is usually created by a little bit more velocity to the river, but the velocity is slowed in many places, usually by large rocks, usually by large boulders or high and low spots in the river, even just in medium-sized substrate. Pocket water could be a combination of rocks and logs and all kinds of things, but basically it's a section of river, or some rivers are made mostly of pocket water, where it's just constant change. There isn't much consistent flow. The water's
like tumbling water, right? It's like that quintessential mountain stream shot that you always see with a bunch of boulders and a bunch of water cascading over it, kind of like white watery style.
Yes, and the main current's all going the same direction, right? But because it comes up against all of these larger rocks or larger pieces of structure, it's speeding up and then slowing down, speeding up and slowing down all the way across the river, and almost sometimes in steps, where it's got a little weir of rocks that are spread out across the river, and the current as it goes around a rock speeds up, but behind a rock slows down, and it creates a lot of feeding zones for the trout. It also creates a lot of places they can hide. It creates a lot of different speeds of current, so there's a lot of opportunity. It's a great place to fish because pocket water shields us from the fish a bit as well. It's moving pretty quick oftentimes, water is, and that allows you to get closer to the fish oftentimes, even in pretty clear water situations. And then the pockets, the challenge that the pocket water presents is that all of the conflicting surface currents make it really hard to get a nice drag-free drift. So if you're reaching across, you're laying your line across 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different speeds of currents. As soon as that line and leader land, they're getting dragged at all kinds of different speeds. Therefore, your fly gets pulled downstream faster than you would like. So it can be a rather complicated piece of water to fish, but it's a very productive piece of water to fish when done properly.
It's also good because since the flies are moving faster, the fish don't have a lot of time to make a decision whether they want to eat it or not. Is that
great
correct?
Point? Absolutely, that's a great point. The fish don't have a long time like they would in a pool. In a pool, they can see your fly coming from many, sometimes in clear water, 10, 12, 20 feet away. Right. In pocket water, the fly might drop in 10, 12 inches above them, and it's going to be gone in 1.5 seconds or a half a second. So they got to make an instant decision on whether or not to pounce on that food or not. Because they have to make that split-second decision, they make a lot of bad decisions.
That's true.
Kind of like Pablo and I in our youth, but that's water
true.
under the bridge.
Also, kind of like our merchandise line.
Real bad decision. Don't cut holes in for the back nipple.
My. Ladies and gentlemen, it's getting late over here.
It is
and
getting
you can
late.
tell. It's where the tops come off.
Oh boy.
The last one we have left to talk about is the undercut bank.
Cool.
Is it found in almost all rivers, or is it more rivers that have like kind of grass and stuff?
I
I associate it with that kind of like grassy, sort of meadowy style, but
that's where it would be most prevalent for sure. I would argue I can't think of any river I've ever fished that doesn't have any undercut banks.
Okay.
Even if it's a spring creek that has really consistent flows, it still usually has undercut banks. And then you think about, contrast that to a large freestone river that experiences incredible highs and incredible lows, and those incredible highs still at certain flows is going to have some undercut banks. When the river is really low, it's going to have less of them, right? But
okay,
I would argue that just about every trout stream I've ever fished at some point has some undercut banks.
Okay.
I would even expand that one to just called bankside lies, whether they're undercut or not. The bank, much like the bottom of the river, slows the flow. So because the water encounters the bank, or it encounters whatever that is, grass, rock, sand, logs, it's friction, and it's slowing the flow near that river bank. The size of the things that the water comes up against dictate how slow or how much slow water there is. But those bankside lies offer a lot of things. Look structure-wise, for the fish, it offers food, first and foremost. You have not only the aquatic insects that are drifting from the bottom of the river and the bankside lie, but you also have an influx of terrestrial options, whether that's grasshoppers, crickets, ants, beetles, ET, mice, small birds. There's all kinds of things that could fall in on a bank. A frog,
right.
In some cases, catastrophically fall in there. In other cases, are jumping in to change positions or get across the the river, and the fish can take advantage of them. But it also offers the hiding spot of a bank. You've got overhanging bushes, or you have an undercut bank, as you were explaining earlier, where the water is kind of hollowed out underneath the bank.
Yeah.
And fish they love that kind of structure, especially brown trout, cutthroat trout, brookies. Rainbows certainly get under them too, but rainbows oftentimes probably, I guess I would argue rainbows are more commonly found in riffles and
right, they like
pockety
faster
stuff.
water, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the driftless, you'll see those browns underneath every undercut bank.
Absolutely.
Has like 3 or 4 stacked down there.
Yeah.
And actually, the biggest fish I caught in the driftless was probably by itself in one of them, and it was a nice fish.
Always good water. Bankside lies are awesome. They present some challenges because you got to fish, you're casting under overhanging brush, you're casting tight to grassy banks or sticks or rocks or logs that are near the bank. It's a snag prone area, but
it is.
With some
Snagtown, USA.
skilled casting, you can high percentage of the time at least have good success landing casts right where they need to be.
Practice your casting, folks.
New in the Nowhere podcast, okay? You need to practice casting, okay?
We've talked about this before. You got to go practice your casting.
Yes. When you break your leg, you wear a cast. Practice it.
Might not be the same thing.
Don't work with me here.
Work with me.
Is that one of your lyrics?
Yeah, work with me? Yes.
No. Neither here nor there.
Nope. It's nowhere. So let's keep moving on. And I think one thing that we should definitely mention about finding fish in a river, which to me, I think is probably the number one thing that I certainly look at, is finding the seam. Why don't you give us a Lance definition of what the seam is?
A Lance definition of the seam. Well,
This is S-E-A-M, by the way.
Yes, not S-E-E-M.
Yes.
It seems that you have it correct.
Oh.
Seam. So a seam is where currents are merging usually. Seams can sometimes be visually found by, a couple ways. One is just seeing a slightly slower flow. Most commonly, it's where you'll see bubbles or surface stuff that gets stuck to the surface, leaves, weeds, that kind of stuff can kind of get concentrated in a seam. But a seam most of the time would be a confluence of currents. And so you would have collection of food at that confluence because it usually has 2 currents coming together, therefore kind of concentrating the food. So it's a great feeding place for trout.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, seam can be really good, especially like where really fast water meets slow water. The fish can hang in the slow water and they can get fed all the food that comes from the slow water as well as the fast water, right? So it's that meeting of 2 currents that offers lots of food, but use the energy by hanging in the slow current. They're using or reserving the energy that they can by hanging in the slow current, taking advantage of the food brought to the fish by both the fast and the slow currents.
All right, so they hang out on the seam and they pop their head in on the fast water and grab the little nymph that rolls by and they jump back into the slow water. They kind of play sides basically, which is cool. So I'm always looking for seams, and these seams are found in all of the different sections of the river that we just spoke about, right?
Absolutely.
I would say if you're a noob and you're just starting out and you're trying to find where you can find a fish in any of these sections, look for where 2 different water types, fast or slow, are converging, and there'll probably be a fish somewhere around there.
Right.
And a seam is actually also considered structure. So what's the one thing that we said? Always look for structure. A seam is actually a really good piece of structure to fish when you're out there with your boots in the water.
Right.
Or feet if you're wet wading.
You probably still have boots on, I hope.
Yeah. Well, I wear Chacos sometimes.
Do you really?
Yeah, I put studs in them.
That doesn't fly very well around here. You end up with no toenails and bruised heels.
Oh
and
yeah,
ankles.
that happens to me a lot.
If you're in a boat, that's okay. But wading around, that's bad news.
No, I know my ankles get just torched. It's not fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I want to look cool. That's more important to me. So I wear Chacos, and I'm like, yeah, what's up, people?
Cool kid alert.
When did Chacos become cool? I've never noticed that.
That's a good point. They're definitely not cool when you put studs in them and you walk on concrete and you're this really weird dude.
Weird noises coming from your feet.
Yeah, that's not a good thing. So I think that pretty much covers the river scenario. There's a lot there to kind of dissect. I think if you want a more in-depth breakdown of all this, you should look into Lance's videos because they really take their time with it, and you have an actual visual that goes along with it, which is so helpful.
Very helpful.
But again, you can always Google these things and you'll see pictures and all sorts of stuff. But we're going to keep moving on here because a lot of people don't just fish rivers, they also fish lakes. So we're going to try and talk a little bit about the structure that you can find in a lake.
Cool.
What I have in my list here, I have first and foremost the bank. Does that count as a structure for you in a lake?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Again, you're looking for a change. So if the bank is all just the same, you might want to find a place where it juts out a little bit or there's some sort of difference. Can you agree with me on this?
Yeah, something different is always good, and it always, all fishing things are so situational.
There are situations.
Whether if you're talking about a large reservoir, the banks can be really good at certain times of year, but maybe not so important others, versus a high alpine lake where most of the food is terrestrial insects. The banks are, and the only structure, really only cover in the shallow, high alpine lake oftentimes is down timber and weed beds that grow in the shallowest parts of the lake. Then that's where the fish are kind of all the time that you have access to them.
That makes sense.
Yeah, the bank is very important. It's just depending on where you're fishing, it's, again, situational. There are situations.
Okay, fair. Yes, there's always a situation. The next one I have here is a drop-off.
Perfect.
I feel like that's a big one in lake fishing.
You gotta always fish the drop-off.
I think that's true actually with beach fishing too, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the drop-off is good because a lot of predatory fish will hang around off the drop-off waiting for little guys to come across that thing, and then they go and they take that thing down. Is that right?
Right, absolutely, yeah. It's just another transition zone, right? Just like in a river, you have a transition of currents or a transition of water types. There, in a lake, there's not current, but you have again the food that's oftentimes in the shallows, and then you have the transition of that drop off to where they have the fish have access to deep water for safety, but they also have a lot of food in the shallows, and it's that transition point where there's kind of the best of both worlds.
And sometimes it's hard to get to the drop off, but if you have a boat, you might be able to hit it, or if it's close to the bank, sometimes there's a close-in drop-off.
For sure.
That's a good place to look. Another one that I have that I think is a good one, but you can't always hit it unless you're like in a canoe or something, but is a pinch point.
Mm-hmm.
So basically sometimes you'll see in a lake where it kind of looks like a figure eight a little bit, where it's like you have a big part of the lake and then there's like this little pinchy thing, and then there's like a smaller side.
2 points almost meet, but not quite.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess a pinch point kind of incorporates a bit of the bank and the drop off all in one. It's kind of wrapped all in one.
For sure.
2-for-1 sale, if you will.
BOGO.
But so a pinch point's good. It's just, again, all these spots are structure, so there's a change in what's happening. So in the pinch point, it's kind of squeezing everything together, and that will also funnel things together. So that was the other one I had, and you can elaborate on any of these feel so fit, but you don't have to, obviously, either.
Sure.
And then the last one that I have it's a bay.
So that's a good one. I like it. I would describe a bay as an area that has, not incredibly consistent, but more consistent depth. Instead of going from super deep to super shallow really fast, the bay would have more consistent shallows, let's say.
Okay.
It could also be really deep, but it's going to have a consistent depth where you could find at which depth the fish are feeding and then cover that same depth all the way across a large expanse of water and keep finding fish in that, whether those are near the bottom or they're pelagic fish where they're suspended.
Okay.
I don't know the actual term of pelagic, but we use pelagic a lot in trout fishing when we are describing, we being my friends and I,
right,
my fellow Team USA teammates. When we're talking lakes, we talk about pelagic fish being not really structure oriented in per se. They are in a way, but they're not structure like bottom or bank side or anything like that. The structure in the lake sometimes is just a thermocline is a type of structure where the cooler water near the bottom of the lake meets the warmer water near the surface. There's a mixing layer of water and there's a thermocline where trout can be just kind of in no man's land. They might be over 50 feet of water and be 20 feet down, or over 25 feet of water and be 12, 15 feet down. And they'll just kind of be suspended out there in no man's land. And that's another type of structure.
Thermocline is a type of structure.
I would argue so, yeah.
That's great. I love that.
It's not physical structure, but it's a type of structure that's water temperature structure that's holding fish there for sure, holding food and fish.
Yeah, I think it's also, along with that, like people that do ice fishing, I think that the thermocline is probably a big part of that too, wouldn't it be?
Sure could be, yeah. Yeah, depending on the lake. Or not every lake gets it. Depends a bit on depth and that sort of thing. But there's points, which your pinch points were kind of that. But just a main lake point is a really good structure. Wind a main wind direction. Wind shifts and changes, but most lakes that I fish have kind of consistent direction of wind most days where it blows, whether that's north to south or east to west or, some variation of those, where if you can find main lake points that are either providing shelter from too much wind or just driving current and driving food and collecting it on a point and then creating that kind of just like a seam in a river, or even a back eddy. Sometimes it won't appear the exact same as a back eddy in a river, but in a lake you could have a similar situation where the wind creates enough current that it almost creates a seam. Another, I don't know if I'd call it a structure as much as more just a basic thing to understand about lakes, is what's called littoral zone. Littoral zone is basically where light penetration gets to the bottom.
Okay.
And that could be, depending on the clarity of the water, that could be upwards of like 50 feet of water. That's rare. That would be very clear. I'm sure somebody can find some example that they could drop in the comments or something on the podcast about some lake that gets it to 70 or 80. I don't know, but it's rare
Please
to
don't
get
do
it.
That.
Yeah, don't waste everybody's time.
We know
care. We know there are outliers to every one of these generalizations that I'm making. The littoral zone is basically, again, just where light penetration makes it to the bottom. So in really murky water, that might be 6 or 8 feet. In most situations, that's probably more into the teens to 20 foot range.
Okay.
In most trout lakes, let's say. So littoral zone is where, when there's light penetration at the bottom, you're going to have weed growth and you're going to have insects that live down that deep. So that's where most of their food's going to be that's coming from the lake bottom.
Okay.
There's also food in the form of Daphnia, which are basically plankton, right? That can live out in no man's land. Those are usually pelagic fish, are often feeding more on that type of food, versus fish in the weed beds and the shallows and in that littoral zone are going to be feeding on chironomids and on leeches and on bait fish and on scuds and damsels and that sort of stuff.
Okay.
Mayflies and on and on. So littoral zone's a great place to look for fish in the right water temps. If water temps get too warm, they'll push out of there and often become more pelagic. If they stay really consistent and safe for non-lethal temps for trout, there's a lot of food in that littoral zone, so they'll oftentimes be feeding there, and sometimes at different depths, most commonly near the bottom, but they could be chasing damsels. That damsel nymphs migrate to the surface and then swim right below the surface to the nearest flooded brush, rock, bankside, whatever thing they can find to crawl out on that's dry and break open their exoskeleton, hatch into an adult. And they do that kind of kamikaze swim where they're swimming just below the surface. And so you could be fishing littoral zone but fishing right at the surface. Or you could have chironomids hatching, that there's millions of them hatching, and there's going to be some fish catching them as they leave the bottom of the lake bed, and there will be some fish working on eating the chironomids at the surface and the chironomid pupa at the surface. So littoral zone opens up a whole bunch of options, but it's a really important part of a lake to understand.
That was very informative. I did not know any of that. Probably we'll be doing definitely a podcast on lake fishing, because it's kind of like the ugly stepchild of American fly fishing, and it shouldn't be.
No,
it shouldn't be. All right, so that's pretty good. That's starting out for the lake. I mean, I think I have enough information to go out there and kind of check it out. I knew a little bit, but I didn't know all the littoral zone and all that stuff. I knew the thermocline, but you're throwing some new knowledge here, and that was very cool.
Keep in mind, lakes are temperature sensitive too. So for trout fishing in lakes, and all fish, but again, trout fishing, they are, when the water temps are in those prime zones, same as rivers really, when they're in the 40s, they're still fishable, they're active, but they want stuff usually much like in a river where the fish would be found in slower water. The lake's all slow water, but the colder the water, generally speaking, the more a slower presentation works. Moving flies slower. Okay. Versus when the water's warmer, oftentimes you can move things quicker and fish will be more active. And when the water temperature gets too warm, which it often does in lakes, then that's what pushes fish out of the shallows and or deeper in the water column to find the comfort of colder water.
Right, and if we talk about lakes and we talk about the warm water species like the bass and the panfish, for people that are just like getting into this, it's a great place to start if you want to learn how to catch fish. It actually is a great place to practice dry fly fishing also, just catching, bluegill, sunfish, rock bass, and a lot of times you can find them in more like physical structure on the bank, like docks, weed beds.
Yeah, they love that kind of stuff, don't they?
They certainly do. And so I would suggest if you don't have a trout fishery near you, the best thing you can do is go to a warm water lake, usually like any lake that you have in like a public park or whatever, and try and fish for some bass or panfish for that matter.
Right.
About 2 years ago, I had a work trip to New York City. I had a bunch of meetings and stuff. I took my fly rod to all my meetings. In the in-between, I was fishing Central Park. I fished Prospect Park in Brooklyn.
Cool.
And it was super fun. There's a bunch of little panfish in there you can catch on dry flies, and it's just like, it's lights out fishing. I mean, they're all in there, and they're so hungry.
Yeah, they're
the only thing is you
fish.
you got to be okay with spectators, and it gets kind of, I mean, I got nervous at first. I made a lot of mistakes because I was like, people are watching. This is very intimidating, but since it's New York City, eventually that just becomes like part of the ambience, and it's not a big deal. So eventually it's just like, they're like the trees, It's definitely a cool thing to do, and it's a good way to learn, and it's actually really fun too. So, and the last thing we're going to touch upon here, because a lot of people do live on the coast, is the beach fishing, and surf fishing is what they call it. You just fish off the beach, basically.
Sounds gnar, bro.
And you can do it on the East Coast, you can do it on the West Coast, anywhere that the ocean meets the land.
Right.
And it's funny how many parallels there are to everything else that we've talked about as far as structure, because the structure is all kind of the same. And once you figure that out, that's when you really start finding fish in saltwater. I took a class on it when I was in California through Bob Marriott's The Fly Fishing Store.
Mm-hmm.
And Ben was my instructor. He's become a friend of mine, and he's a really insane fisherman and welder. If you have a chance to take his class, I highly recommend it. Although I don't think he's doing it anymore because he works for Elon Musk now. He's like working on rockets, welding rockets, kind of nuts.
Whoa.
Great dude, and he taught me a lot. But if you can take the class through them, I would highly recommend it. I learned a lot about surf fishing through them. What you're really kind of looking for is sort of the same thing, any sort of change. So they have names for them in saltwater fishing. There's holes, there's trenches, there's troughs, there's seams also. That's a big one. There's channels. All of these things are accumulations of sand or where sand gets washed out. And it kind of forms peaks and valleys and little areas where fish can hide out. And since a lot of these fish that you catch in salt water are predatory, they do kind of like ambush their prey and hang out in these little depressions and stuff.
Yeah.
And if you're going to try and get into beach fishing, my number one recommendation would be to watch Rich Troxler's YouTube videos on surf fishing. He's a spin fisher that fishes on the East Coast for stripers, but the dude just,
breaks it down.
Thorough. It's definitely drink coffee before you do it, because it's not like the funnest thing you've ever done. It's definitely like taking a class.
Yes.
Where the lecturer talks for a long time in a monotone voice.
But he's
God
dialed.
bless him. But it's so dialed, and you will just learn everything you ever need to know. If you watch all of his videos, you will catch fish, guaranteed.
That's cool.
The guy's just nuts. And I just found him randomly on YouTube when I was trying to get into it, and I was just, I've referred these videos to so many people, and it really makes a difference, But when you go out there and you start to learn to watch the waves and see like where they break, where one breaks, where one doesn't, you start to see in between them, all those little channels in between the waves are like highways for the fish, and they use that. So you're going to want to cast kind of in those places. And if you can go there when there's low tide and you can see the sand and see where there's depressions, remember where they are, use landmarks behind you, then you can go back at high tide and you know where there's fish hiding out, and you can fish to them.
Cool.
That's another tip I would give. I don't know if you have any tips for saltwater fishing.
My limited amount of beach fishing would be echo what you've said. Just looking for just changes. Whether I've found some fish where there's little tributaries, if you want to call them, little creeks, little inlets coming into the lake or into the ocean, not a lake. And I've caught them in where there's changes from sand to more rock structure.
Yeah.
Any sort of current break, just like you're talking, reading waves and finding out where those little troughs are, where there's if you have waves breaking further out over here and breaking further out on your left and on your right, but right down the center there's a little section that they're not breaking until the waves get all the way into shore. That's telling you there's some deeper water that's not causing the waves to curl, and so that's the type of structure. All those things seem to make a difference. The one other I would add that's maybe not so popular on beaches but sometimes around jetties and things is just using light as structure.
Definitely.
Fishing at night around lights, whether that's dock lights or lights around piers or that kind of stuff. There's the small bait fish are attracted to light, which then attract larger predatory fish, and use that light.
Yeah, that definitely helps. And actually, I didn't realize you were talking about actual real light. I thought you were talking about change in color, but
That's a way to tell for sure. That's a good
another
point.
one too. That when I went to Mexico a few years ago for my anniversary, I was fishing on the beach and I could see far out that there was a bunch of like spots that looked really dark. So, and this thing was like this flat that went out forever. I mean, it was like so big, and it would just stayed like knee deep the whole time. So I went out there to fish, and I was like, oh well, maybe I'll catch a bonefish. I was very hopeful. Didn't happen. I did catch a boxfish though, a few of them.
Cool. All right.
And the big thing was just fishing on the edges of the grass. All those black spots that I was seeing were just like, it was like
weeds.
turtle grass.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, just fishing, putting your fly on just on the edge of that thing, and they would come out and just grab it, you know?
Covering the structure. I like it.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, you just think a little bit. I think another thing that we haven't mentioned throughout this whole podcast,
break it down,
that we should mention is a big tendency for everyone, I think, is get to the river, get to the lake, get to the beach, and just immediately start fishing.
Right.
Instead of actually stopping and like observing. Observing is such a big part of becoming good at this sport.
Sure.
Because you want to like learn and see what you're supposed to be fishing too. It doesn't make any sense to cast a million times in a place where there aren't any fish sitting there, but you're not going to know that unless you actually take the time to stop and like observe a bit.
Right.
So if there's any noob takeaway I can give, that would probably be the one, is just take a second to kind of like look. If you sit on the side of a river or even at the beach and you don't do anything but observe for 10 minutes, it's almost like a veil comes off of the water and you start to notice things that you wouldn't have if you just sat there for 2 minutes.
Right.
It's really weird, but I definitely highly recommend it. And it's crazy how much you'll notice if you like really kind of slow down your breathing and just kind of watch. You know what I mean?
Nerd out.
Yeah, you got to nerd out. Oh, and use polarized glasses, of course. Because
Critical.
otherwise you might have some problems there.
Otherwise you're nerding out to nothingness because you can't see a dang thing.
I hope you guys have enjoyed this this 2-part series here, finding fishable water and finding fishable fish. We covered a lot. It was kind of eye-opening. I learned a bunch. I hope that you guys did too. Lance, of course, didn't learn anything, but that's
Not
to be
true.
expected.
I always learn.
He's a very humble guy, which is why I like him. It's admirable. But anyhow, the next podcast, we're going to talk about what flies to use when and where, and basic forage and what different fish eat in different fisheries. So you can look forward to that. It'll be the big fly podcast. And what's cool about Lance is that he creates his own flies. A lot of patterns that have become ubiquitous across the United States, at least, are actually Lance's patterns that you can find in fly shops and stuff. So we have a preeminent fly tyer and designer talking about what fish eat and when to use these flies. So it should be pretty cool. So please tune in for the next one. This is the Noob of the Knower Fly Fishing Edition. Lance, why don't you say goodbye this time?
Thanks for listening, and we look forward to sharing a little more about the thing we love to do, which is fly fishing, and we will get you on the next podcast.
Smell you later. Peace.
Adios.
This was a Raul Maria production.
Ear sweat is a real thing. I didn't know that before.